All right, so let's get right into it. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a case that has really shaken up the international legal community.
It's a tough one.
It is. We're talking about the forced return of some Turkish nationals from Kenya.
Yeah, and it raises some serious concerns, doesn't it? About human rights violations and just how far a regime will go.
Absolutely. And the implications, I mean, they're huge. We're talking about the potential reach of the Turkish regime. Think about it. Their influence reaching across borders.
Exactly. Transnational repression, that's what we're seeing here. Authoritarian regimes, they're not content with just silencing dissent at home anymore. They're reaching further and further.
Right, it's a really disturbing trend. So to really understand this, we've got a whole bunch of sources we're looking at. There's this in-depth report from Solidarity with Others.
A good place to start.
Yeah, they lay it all out. And then we've got articles from news outlets, places like the BBC, The Nation, all those statements from human rights organizations, Amnesty International, the ICJ, the Turkey Tribunal, you name it.
And even, social media posts from families, pleas for help. It's heartbreaking.
Absolutely. And this case, it's not an isolated incident, unfortunately. Yeah. But what makes it so significant is that it's such a blatant disregard for international law. I mean, completely ignoring the rules.
And that sets a dangerous precedent, for other refugees, for asylum seekers. It makes you wonder, where does it end?
Exactly. So that's what we're going to do today, unpack it all, the legal stuff, the role of diplomatic pressure, the whole 9 yards. We'll see how it all connects, the bigger picture, the impact on human rights globally. It's heavy stuff, but it's important.
Absolutely.
Just imagine being forced back to a place where you're not safe. I mean, that's the reality we're talking about here. So, okay, let's set the scene. It's October 18th, 2024, Nairobi. 7 Turkish nationals, they're abducted, taken from different locations around the city. And we're not talking about random disappearances here.
No, not at all.
This is coordinated, calculated.
Yeah.
The reports, the testimonies. I mean, it's chilling, like something out of a movie.
It is. Witnesses, they describe masked men, multiple vehicles, forced entry. I mean, come on, that's classic state security tactics, right?
Exactly. It's textbook. And the fact that all these people who were abducted, they were associated with the Gulen movement, well, it's not a coincidence.
Right. It raises some serious red flags about the involvement of Turkish national intelligence, the MIT.
And it makes you wonder, just how far does Turkey's influence reach? I mean, are they really willing to completely disregard international borders to go after people they see as a threat?
Seems like it.
Okay, so let's put some faces to these names. Let's talk about the human impact here. You've got Saadet Tasha. She was abducted, just out running an errand. Nekdet Seytolu, a UK citizen, ambushed, detained for hours.
Yeah.
And then there's this case, this 16-year-old, Abdullah Gink, taken with his father.
I mean, the abduction of a minor, a child, that's a clear violation of human rights. And separating him from his family like that, it just makes you wonder, what are they going to do to him in Turkey? What's going to happen?
It's terrifying. And then you've got this CCTV footage. It shows Mustafa Cenek and his son just leaving their home. And then, boom, these suspicious vehicles, they show up right after.
That's damning evidence right there. You can't deny that.
Hard to. It really looks like they were being watched, followed.
Yeah.
And it adds another layer to the whole thing. It's the premeditation, the planning. And then to make things even more complicated, there's this letter from a law firm. They represent the abductees. And they're urging airlines, all airlines, to follow the principle of non-refoulement.
Right. So non-refoulement, it's a big deal. It's like the cornerstone of international refugee law. Basically, countries, they can't return refugees to a place where they could be persecuted. Simple as that.
And this letter, it's basically saying, hey, airlines, you get involved in transporting these people back to Turkey, you could be in big trouble legally.
Yeah, they're putting them on notice.
Big time. Okay, so now Kenya, they're saying, hey, we did everything by the book. And they're pointing to their strong historical ties with Turkey.
But that's not really the point, is it? It's like they're trying to sidestep the whole issue. They're obligated to uphold international law, not to mention their own Refugee Act of 2021. I mean, they signed these agreements.
Right, and that's where it gets messy. How do you balance your relationships with other countries with your commitment to human rights? What happens when those two things clash?
Tough question.
It is. And in this case, well, Kenya's actions, they've been condemned by a lot of international organizations, Amnesty International, the ICJ, you name it. They're all saying, hey, this is a violation, a serious violation.
And they're right. It's a huge red flag. Kenya's behavior, it's sending shockwaves through the international community.
And rightfully so. I mean, come on. It makes you think, Are countries like Turkey using their diplomatic muscle to pressure other nations to basically get what they want, even if it means stepping all over individual rights?
It's a scary thought, isn't it? That kind of power.
It is.
Yeah.
And we'll be digging into that more, but before we do, there's one thing that's been bugging me. Turkey, they've been awfully quiet about this whole thing.
You're right. That is strange. I mean, in the past, they haven't exactly been shy about, publicizing these kinds of operations. They've bragged about capturing and returning people they consider dissidents.
It's almost like a PR stunt for them,
Yeah.
So why the silence now?
Mm-hmm.
It's a big deal. It's gotten international attention. Something's not adding up.
It does make you wonder what their game is, right?
Exactly. What are they hiding? Are they trying to avoid scrutiny, or have they changed their tactics?
Good questions.
Lots of them. Okay, so let's add another piece to this puzzle. Recently, Kenya and Turkey, they've signed some defense agreements, pretty big ones.
Like the Bayraktar TB2 drone training.
Yeah.
And that defense industry cooperation agreement back in 2023.
Those are the ones. And it makes you wonder, could these agreements be influencing Kenya's decisions?
Yeah.
Are they compromising on human rights because they're trying to keep Turkey happy?
It's a possibility. And the Freedom House report, the one cited in the Solidarity with Others document, it talks about this, how Turkey uses military partnerships for political leverage.
So it's not just a theory then. It's actually happening. We need to figure out how these agreements played into this whole deportation situation. Even if it was indirect, the connection is there.
Definitely worth looking into.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, we need to talk about the media. They've been instrumental in getting this story out there.
Absolutely. They've shown a spotlight on it. Places like the BBC, The Nation, Stockholm Center for Freedom, they've all been covering it, each with their own angle. It's important to see the different perspectives.
And it's their coverage, along with the statements from all these human rights organizations, that's really put pressure on both Kenya and Turkey. I mean, they have to respond, even if it's just to try and defend themselves.
It shows how crucial a free press is, especially when you're dealing with powerful forces trying to bury the truth.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for everyone listening, it's a reminder, staying informed, it's not just about being in the know, it's about having the power to hold people accountable.
Mm-hmm.
So for those of you who are really into the legal side of this, well, it gets even more interesting. We're talking about a blatant disregard for international law here, especially when it comes to protecting refugees.
Yeah, it's a dangerous precedent to set. If Kenya gets away with this, what's to stop other countries from doing the same?
Exactly. And the implications are huge, not just for this case, but for refugees everywhere.
It undermines the whole system.
It really does. So in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to unpack this whole non-refoulement principle, take a close look at Kenya's Refugee Act, and see what legal options are out there to fight these deportations.
Yeah. Let's get into the nitty-gritty, the laws, the organizations involved, and what they can actually do. And we'll look at the broader picture, too, how this impacts refugee protection globally, especially in a world that's so connected.
Right. And that's where your expertise comes in. This case, it's a real-life example of how challenging human rights law can be, the struggles to make those international agreements mean something. So stick with us. We'll be right back after a short break.
Looking forward to it. So before the break, we were talking about Kenya and how they basically ignored international law and what that means for other refugees and asylum seekers, people trying to find safety.
And it's a big deal. For those of you listening who are familiar with, like, the European Court of Human Rights and their rulings, you'll see some pretty interesting parallels with the principles at play here. It shows that these rights, they're universal, and every country has a duty to uphold them, no matter where you are in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break down this concept, this non-refoulement principle. It's a core part of international refugee law, and it's pretty straightforward. Countries can't send refugees back to places where they could face danger, where they could be persecuted. It's that simple.
Makes sense.
And this principle, it's enshrined in the 1951 Refugee Convention, which, over 140 countries have signed on to, ratified it, Kenya included.
Right, so they're part of the club, they agreed to these rules, and they even went a step further, right? They put these principles into their own Refugee Act back in 2021.
Yeah.
So it's like, what's going on here? How can they justify deporting these people when they have these laws in place?
Yeah, that's the head scratcher, isn't it? It's like you're looking at a direct conflict here. What they did goes against both the convention and their own laws. And what's even more concerning is that they didn't even give these people a chance to, defend themselves. No due process, just snatch them up, detain them, and ship them out.
So it seems like they might be choosing their relationship with Turkey over human rights, over following the law, their own law. And that's not a good look for their justice system, is it?
Not at all. It really makes you think, how do we make sure that diplomatic pressure, one country trying to sway another, how do we make sure that doesn't override a nation's duty to protect people's basic rights, especially those seeking asylum? What can we do to hold states accountable when they go rogue like this?
Big questions. I mean, this is something legal experts and human rights advocates are constantly battling with. So, practically speaking, what legal options are there in a situation like this? Can these deportations be challenged in court?
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely legal avenues to explore. The families of those who are deported or their lawyers, they could file lawsuits in Kenyan courts. They could argue that the deportations were illegal, both under Kenyan and international law. And there's also the option of taking the case to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. They have the power to investigate human rights abuses and make recommendations to member states.
So there are international bodies that can step in. That's good to know. It emphasizes how important it is to have these different layers of protection for human rights. But what about the role of human rights organizations in all of this? What are they doing?
Groups like Amnesty International, the ICJ, the Turkey Tribunal, they've been all over this. They've condemned Kenya's actions, demanded investigations, and called for transparency. They're pushing both Kenya and Turkey to honor their commitments to international law.
They're really putting the pressure on, which is so important. They're speaking up for the people who've been silenced and pushing for real change to happen.
Exactly. And their work is not just about reacting to crises, it's about helping us understand these complex issues. They do research, document abuses, help with legal aid, and push for better policies to protect human rights. They're essential in keeping states in check and making sure these kinds of violations don't slip under the radar.
It really shows how interconnected human rights advocacy is globally. What happens in Kenya or Turkey, it's not just their problem. It affects everyone. It's about upholding a global standard for human rights for everyone, no matter where they are. But amidst all this legal talk, the international pressure, we can't forget about the people at the heart of this story. What do we know about the 4 people who were actually deported? What's happening to them now?
Well, the information's pretty scarce, and that's part of the problem, We've heard reports that they're being held in Turkish prisons, but without any independent observers or legal representation. It's tough to verify anything or know how they're being treated. Their families are left in limbo, not knowing what's happening to their loved ones. It's awful.
And it brings us back to Turkey's silence. It's deafening. They haven't officially acknowledged the detentions, and they're not responding to any requests for information.
Yeah.
Not from international organizations, not even from the families.
And that silence is pretty telling, isn't it? It makes you worry about what's happening behind closed doors in Turkey. What are they hiding?
It's a chilling thought, and it raises serious concerns about the possibility of further human rights abuses. I mean, we've already seen how far they're willing to go.
Right, and this is where the concept of enforced disappearance comes into play. It's a term in international law, and it refers to situations where people are taken by the state or groups working with the state, and then the state denies any knowledge of it, or they try to hide what happened to the person.
So given what we know about this case, is it possible that these deportations could be considered enforced disappearances?
I'd say it's a real possibility,
Yeah.
especially knowing Turkey's track record of silencing critics. They've done this before.
It's a scary thought, the fact that this is even on the table. And it makes you wonder, what's the role of the Turkish National Intelligence, the MIT, in all of this? I mean, the way these abductions were carried out, the fact that they targeted people linked to the Gulen movement, Turkey's silence afterwards, it all points to a coordinated effort to get rid of dissent.
It's a reminder that this fight for human rights, it's not just about individual cases, it's about challenging entire systems of oppression and holding the powerful accountable for their actions.
Couldn't agree more. So we've been focusing on Kenya, but to get the full picture, we need to zoom out, think bigger, and look at the implications beyond this one case.
Yeah, we need to talk about this wider trend of transnational repression. Authoritarian regimes are getting bolder, reaching beyond their borders to silence anyone who speaks out against them.
And it's happening everywhere, not just in this case. Extradition requests, Interpol notices, online harassment, surveillance, even physical threats and attacks. It's a global problem. And it's a serious threat to human rights in the 21st century.
Absolutely, and this case is a prime example of that. It shows that in our interconnected world, human rights violations, they don't stop at borders anymore.
It's a harsh reality. So how do we fight this? What strategies can we use to push back against this transnational repression and protect the people who are being targeted by these authoritarian regimes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. We need to strengthen the laws, improve cooperation between countries, empower human rights organizations, and raise awareness among the public. And we need to understand that this isn't just a job for governments.
You're right, it's on all of us. Businesses, civil society, individuals, everyone needs to step up and do their part to protect human rights and push back against this trend.
Exactly. The media, academics, legal professionals, everyone has a role to play. By shining a light on these issues, conducting research, offering legal expertise, and fighting for change, we can all contribute to a more just and fair world.
Absolutely. But before we jump into solutions, let's not forget about the families directly affected by this case. What can we do to support them? They need justice, and they need to be reunited with their loved ones.
That's crucial. These families are dealing with immense trauma and uncertainty. Organizations like the UNHCR and other humanitarian groups are providing legal aid, psychosocial support, and help with family reunification. It's a tough process, but they're doing incredible work.
Their work is so important, especially when you're dealing with these complicated legal systems and bureaucracies. But this case also shows us that we need to fix the system itself. What can we do to prevent this from happening again? To make sure other people don't become victims of these tactics?
Yeah, that's the long game, isn't it? We need a fundamental shift in how the international community responds to transnational repression. We need to hold states accountable when they break the law, and we need stronger ways to protect people who are being targeted across borders. It's not easy, but it's necessary.
We've talked about the legal side, the international pressure, the human rights organizations, but what about stopping it before it even starts? What are the preventative measures?
That's where we need to address the root causes of this kind of repression. We're talking about promoting democratic values, strengthening the rule of law, supporting civil society organizations, especially in countries where human rights are under attack.
It's a long-term plan, for sure, but it's essential if we want a more just and fair world. But in the meantime, what can we do right now to address the problems this case has exposed? For example, what about the airlines? They're involved in transporting these people. What's their responsibility in preventing the deportation of individuals who might face persecution?
You're hitting on a key point. Airlines have a huge role to play in upholding this non-refoulement principle. They have a responsibility to make sure they're not complicit in human rights violations, and that includes not transporting people to countries where they might be in danger.
So what can they do, practically speaking? How can they make sure they're complying with the law and acting ethically?
They need to be really careful, do their due diligence. That means consulting with human rights groups, training their staff to recognize potential refoulement cases, and being willing to refuse transport if they think someone might be at risk.
So it's about being proactive, not just reacting after something bad has already happened. They need to recognize that they have a part to play in upholding human rights and making sure their business practices don't cause harm.
Exactly. And this responsibility, it's not just for airlines. It's for any company or organization that operates on a global scale. Businesses, banks, tech companies, everyone needs to step up and protect human rights. They can't just bury their heads in the sand and pretend it's not their problem.
It's about recognizing that human rights are everyone's business. It's not just something for governments to handle. We all need to work together.
Absolutely. Individuals, too. Each one of us has a role to play in defending human rights and holding the powerful accountable for their actions.
I've learned so much from this conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise on this incredibly important issue. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to the recommendations from the Solidarity with Others report. They've outlined some concrete steps that can be taken to address what happened in this case and prevent it from happening again.
Right. They've laid out a plan for moving forward. They're calling for an independent international investigation into the abductions and deportations. They want Kenya to publicly reaffirm its commitment to protecting refugees and to put better checks and balances in place to prevent foreign intelligence agencies from meddling with its asylum policies. And they're urging the UN and other human rights groups to step up their monitoring and hold both Kenya and Turkey accountable.
These are all essential steps to ensure justice, restore faith in Kenya's commitment to human rights, and prevent other countries from using their power to influence Kenya's decisions about asylum seekers. But what about Turkey? Are there recommendations for them too?
Definitely. They need to be held accountable as well. The report calls on them to stop using these tactics, this transnational repression, to silence their critics. They need to be transparent, guarantee human rights protections for everyone, no matter their political beliefs, and establish safe and legal ways for people to return if they choose to.
It's a lot to ask. But without pressure and accountability, they're likely to keep doing this. And the report also emphasizes the need to prioritize the rights of the families affected by these actions. It's not just about the individuals who were deported, it's about their loved ones who were left behind.
Absolutely. They specifically recommend that immigration services and the UNHCR speed up the family reunification process for refugee families that have been separated due to political persecution.
That's so important, especially in cases like Öztürk'ün's, where his family in the Netherlands had been waiting for months to be reunited with him before he was abducted. It's a stark reminder that these actions have far-reaching consequences, causing trauma and separation for entire families.
And then there's the issue of the airlines. The report urges them, along with aviation authorities, to refuse to transport refugees or asylum seekers back to countries where they could be in danger.
It underscores the fact that everyone has a role to play in upholding human rights. Airlines and other companies, they need to be aware of these issues and make sure their actions don't violate international law or ethical standards.
Ignorance is no excuse. They can't just say, oh, this is a government issue. Companies have a responsibility to respect human rights and make sure their operations aren't contributing to violations.
This has been a heavy conversation, but it's so crucial to understand these complex issues and to remember that the fight for human rights never ends. It demands our attention and vigilance.
You're absolutely right. We can't get complacent. The erosion of human rights in one part of the world can have a ripple effect, impacting all of us. It's our collective duty to speak out against these violations, to hold the powerful accountable, and to strive for a world where everyone's rights are respected and protected.
So as we wrap up this discussion, I want to leave our listeners with a question, a challenge. What can you do in your own life to contribute to this fight?
It doesn't have to be grand gestures. It can be simple things. Staying informed, talking about these issues with others, supporting human rights organizations, contacting your elected officials to voice your concerns. Every action, big or small, makes a difference.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this conversation has been insightful and has motivated you to get involved in the fight for a better world. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for justice. We've really dug deep into this whole situation, the transnational repression, the violations of basic human rights. It's heavy stuff. But I want to take a minute to speak directly to those of you who are especially interested in the legal side of things, the judicial processes. For those of you in academia, studying law, or thinking about a career in international law, this case, it's a textbook example, unfortunately, of the challenges we face in upholding international law.
It really exposes the weaknesses, doesn't it? When states just ignore their obligations, how do we ensure accountability? That's the question.
It is, and it's not an easy one to answer. It makes you question, are the mechanisms we have in place, are they really effective? Do we need stronger ways to enforce these laws?
Big questions, for sure.
And for legal scholars, this case, it's a gold mine, so to speak. I mean, it raises some fundamental questions like how do we balance a state's sovereignty, their right to govern themselves, with the responsibility to protect human rights, especially when those violations are happening outside their borders? And how do we make those international legal frameworks stronger, more effective, so they can actually deal with this transnational repression, which is becoming more and more common?
Yeah, those are the discussions we need to be having, the research that needs to be done.
Exactly. It's about pushing the boundaries of legal thought, coming up with new solutions. And for those of you who are, on the path to becoming international lawyers, this case is a prime example of how important it is to understand all the different aspects of law, how they interact, domestic law, international treaties, regional human rights mechanisms. It's all connected.
It's not just about the law on paper, it's about the reality on the ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And advocating for human rights, it takes more than just legal arguments. You need to understand the political landscape, the diplomacy involved, the power of public pressure. It all plays a role.
It's multidimensional, that's for sure.
It is. And it's a constant fight. It's about being vigilant, challenging those in power, never letting up. We've talked about the role of international organizations, the media, holding corporations accountable, but I want to end this deep dive by really emphasizing the power of individual action. You, listening right now, many of you are already in those legal and academic circles, so what can you do within your own spheres of influence to contribute to this fight? How can you help combat transnational repression and protect human rights?
Well, if you're in academia, keep researching, keep writing, keep teaching about these issues. That's how you shape public understanding, how you influence policy. And for those of you who are going to be lawyers, think about specializing in international human rights law. Your expertise will be in high demand, representing victims, advocating for legal reform, making a real difference.
And for everyone, regardless of your profession, stay informed, stay engaged, have those critical conversations, support human rights organizations, hold your elected officials accountable, make your voice heard.
Don't underestimate your power. Every action, every voice, it all adds up. It all contributes to a more just world.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. I want to thank you for joining us and for engaging with these crucial issues. Remember, the fight for human rights is ongoing. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and it requires all of us to participate. So keep learning, keep questioning, keep pushing for a better world, a world where everyone's rights are respected and protected. Until next time.